October 31st, 2022. It was Halloween night, and the four of us, Jessica, Dylan, Marie, and Nick, decided to revisit our childhood neighborhood for some nostalgia. It had been years since we'd gone trick-or-treating, and with all of us back home for fall break, we thought it would be fun to walk the streets we grew up on, admiring the elaborate decorations and reliving the thrill of collecting candy. We were all dressed in makeshift costumes. Nothing fancy, just something to get into the spirit. Jessica, always the leader, was in her old cheerleading uniform, while Dylan had a cheap vampire cape he bought from the drugstore last minute. Marie, the most dedicated to the theme, wore a black witch hat, and Nick had on a superhero mask that barely covered his face. We laughed and joked as we walked, our bags slowly filling up with candy from familiar houses, the smell of autumn leaves and bonfires in the air. The night was going great until we found ourselves at the end of Crescent Lane. It was a secluded part of the neighborhood, the kind of street you wouldn't go down unless you had a reason. The last house on the lane was one we'd all heard stories about as kids, a big old Victorian-style place with peeling paint and overgrown bushes. It was the kind of house that looked haunted even on a sunny day. None of us remembered ever seeing anyone actually live there, but tonight there were lights on, and the porch was decorated with cobwebs and carved pumpkins. A sign out front read, "Come if you dare." "We have to check it out," Nick said, trying to sound brave but clearly intrigued by the creepy aesthetic. Marie looked uneasy, hugging herself as the wind picked up. "I don't know, guys. This place gives me the creeps." Dylan rolled his eyes, flashing his phone to record some footage for his TikTok. "Come on, Marie. It's just for fun. Look, we'll be in and out." Jessica, always the skeptic, nodded. "Yeah, it's just some old lady trying to get in on the Halloween spirit. Let's go." She led the way up the cracked walkway, and we all followed, though Marie hesitated, glancing back down the empty lane. The door creaked open before we could even knock. An elderly woman stood there, dressed in a long, tattered black gown, a pointed hat perched on her head. She smiled, showing crooked teeth. "Trick-or-treaters," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "I haven't had any of you in years. Come in, come in. I have something special for you." We exchanged glances, unsure if we should actually go inside, but the woman stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. "Come now, don't be shy," she insisted. Against our better judgment, we stepped over the threshold, the door creaking closed behind us. The house was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of something earthy, like dried herbs. The woman led us into a sitting room where a small fire crackled in the hearth. "Sit, sit," she said, pointing to the old couches and chairs. We sat down awkwardly, our bags of candy resting on our laps. "I want to tell you a story," the woman said, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "A story about secrets." She looked directly at Jessica. "Secrets that even you don't want to admit to yourself." Jessica scoffed, crossing her arms. "All right, lady, let's hear it." The woman smiled, her eyes narrowing. A girl, estranged from her mother, carries the weight of anger and regret. She pretends she's fine, but the truth is, she fears becoming just like her. Jessica's face went pale, her confident demeanor faltering. "How do you—" she began. But the woman moved on, her gaze now fixed on Dylan. "A boy who laughs, who hides behind jokes and sarcasm, but wakes in the night, paralyzed, unable to breathe, unable to scream. He fears the shadows, but won't tell a soul." Dylan shifted uncomfortably, his eyes widening. He hadn't told anyone about the sleep paralysis, not even us. Marie was already trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. The woman turned to her, her voice softening. A girl who once felt the water closing in, who heard nothing but silence as she sank, and yet survived. But she still dreams of it, doesn't she? The cold, dark water. Marie let out a small sob, her hands shaking as she covered her face. Nick tried to laugh, his voice shaky. "Okay, this is getting weird. Let's just go." But the woman's eyes were on him now, her smile fading. A boy with a broken heart, haunted by the one who left him, She's still here, isn't she? Watching you, wondering why you weren't enough. Nick's face fell, his bravado crumbling. He looked around, almost as if he expected to see his ex standing in the shadows. "We're leaving," Jessica said, standing up, her voice shaking. But when she tried to move, her feet wouldn't budge. It was like they were glued to the floor. Dylan tried to stand too, but he couldn't move either. Marie was sobbing openly now, and Nick was breathing heavily, panic setting in. The woman's voice dropped to a whisper. "You can't leave until you face your truths. The secrets you keep, the fears you hide. They're what bind you here." She moved closer, her shadow stretching across the room, dark and foreboding. Jessica struggled, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you want from us?" she yelled. The woman just smiled, her face inches from Jessica's. "I want you to listen. I want you to remember." The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in. The fire flickered, the shadows growing longer, darker. We were trapped, our fears laid bare, the woman's whispers echoing in our minds. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The woman stepped back, her smile fading. "Go," she said, her voice no longer menacing but tired. "Take your truths with you, and never forget them." We found ourselves able to move, scrambling to our feet and rushing for the door. We burst out into the cold night air, our hearts pounding, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We ran down the driveway, not stopping until we were far away from that house, from that lane. When we finally stopped, we looked at each other, the fear still etched on our faces. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. We all knew what had happened, knew that the woman had seen into us, had known things no one else could know. We never went back to Crescent Lane. We never spoke about that night again. But the memory lingered, the secrets we had tried to bury now forever a part of us. And every Halloween, when the air turns cold and the leaves rustle in the wind, I can't help but think of that house, of the woman's whispers, and of the truths we can never escape. Story 2, October 15th, 2022. It was a chilly Saturday night when the four of us, Ethan, Sarah, Luke, and Ben, decided to sneak into the abandoned carnival grounds at Shade Creek. We'd all heard the rumors about it being haunted, but curiosity got the better of us. It had been years since the carnival closed down, the rides left to rust, the booths falling apart. No one had been in there for years, or at least no one had come back with a story to tell. We parked Ethan's old Jeep a few blocks away and walked towards the entrance. Ethan was leading, as always. He loved anything that got his heart racing, especially when it meant ignoring every no trespassing sign along the way. Sarah, ever the rational one, was recording everything on her phone, talking about how it was all just rumors and psychological tricks. "Our minds create fear where there isn't any," she said, her voice steady, but there was a nervousness in her eyes that told a different story. The entrance gate was rusted, the paint chipped away, and it let out a loud groan as Ethan pushed it open. We slipped inside, our flashlights flickering as we looked around. The place was eerie, the rides towering over us like skeletal remains. The Ferris wheel was still there, one of its cars swaying slightly in the breeze, the creaking sound echoing through the empty grounds. Ben, the quiet one, shivered, his eyes darting around. He'd never liked crowds, and even in the emptiness of the abandoned carnival, it felt like something was lurking, watching us. "Come on, guys, let's check out the funhouse," Ethan said, his voice filled with excitement. Luke, the skeptic, shook his head. "This place is a death trap, Ethan. We should have stayed home." But he followed anyway, always the protector of the group, never letting us go too far without him. The funhouse was dark, the mirrors cracked, dust covering everything. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing. Sarah was trying to explain how fear was a natural response to unfamiliar surroundings, when suddenly the music started, that old carnival tune, scratchy and distorted. We all froze, our flashlights flickering. "That's not funny, Ethan," Sarah said, but Ethan just shook his head, his face pale. "I didn't do anything." We moved deeper into the funhouse, the music growing louder, and then we saw it, A figure, dressed in a vintage clown costume, standing at the end of the hallway, its head tilted to one side. Ethan's face went white. "No way," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He had always laughed off his fear of clowns, but I could see the terror in his eyes now. The clown didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. "It's probably some prank," Luke said, though his voice wavered. But then the lights flickered, and the clown was gone. Ben let out a gasp, his flashlight shaking in his hands. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. We turned to leave, but the hallway behind us was gone. Instead, there was a series of carnival booths, each one lit up, each one with a sign bearing our names. "What the hell is this?" Luke muttered, his eyes wide. The booth with Ethan's name had a clown mask hanging from it, the words, "Face your fear," painted above it. Ethan shook his head, backing away. No way. Sarah's booth had a broken family portrait, her parents' faces scratched out, the words, "The truth hurts," scrawled beneath it. She stood there, frozen, her eyes wide, her rational explanations gone. Luke's booth had an old football jersey hanging from it, a scene from his past playing on a loop on a dusty TV, the day he got injured, the day his dreams of being an athlete ended. He clenched his fists, his face a mix of anger and fear. Ben's booth was the worst. It was filled with mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of him, surrounded by faceless figures, the words, "You can't hide," written across the glass. He backed away, his breathing shallow. "I'm not doing this," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. The clown appeared again, this time closer, its head still tilted, its eyes dark and empty. It raised a hand, pointing at us, and the booths lit up, the games starting on their own. The music grew louder, distorted laughter echoing through the funhouse. "We have to go!" Ethan yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm. But there was no way out, the walls shifting, the mirrors reflecting not just us, but the clown, over and over again. Sarah screamed as the family portrait in her booth shattered, the pieces flying towards her. Luke tried to break the mirrors in Ben's booth, but the glass wouldn't crack. Ethan was frozen, staring at the clown mask, his worst fear staring back at him. And Ben, poor Ben, was on the ground, his hands over his ears, trying to block out the laughter that only he could hear. I don't know how we got out. One moment we were trapped, the clown closing in, the games taunting us with our deepest fears. And then we were outside, the cold night air hitting our faces, the carnival silent behind us. We ran, not stopping until we reached Ethan's Jeep, our hearts pounding, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We didn't speak as Ethan started the car, his hands shaking on the wheel. We drove away, the abandoned carnival disappearing in the rearview mirror, the silence in the car heavy. No one knew what to say. We had all seen something that night, something that knew us, something that wanted us to remember. We never talked about what happened at Shade Creek. We never went back. But the memory lingered, the fear never quite leaving us. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that distorted carnival music, the laughter echoing in the distance, a reminder of the night we faced our worst fears and barely made it out. Story 3. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and the sun bathed Sarah's backyard in a golden glow. Colorful balloons swayed in the breeze, and the scent of grilled hot dogs drifted through the air. Sarah looked around, her heart swelling with pride at the sight of her daughter, Emily, laughing with her friends, all dressed in their party hats. This was what she wanted, a moment of pure joy for her little girl, something she could remember fondly. "Mommy, is he here yet?" Emily's eyes sparkled with excitement as she clung to Sarah's arm. "He should be here any minute, sweetheart," Sarah replied, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. She was exhausted. Between juggling work and raising 2 kids on her own, moments like these were rare. She wanted everything to be perfect today. Not long after, a van pulled up in front of the house. The side of it was painted in bright colors with the words, "Mr. Giggles." children's entertainer extraordinaire. Out stepped Mr. Giggles himself, a clown dressed in oversized polka-dotted pants, suspenders, and a red nose that squeaked when he touched it. He waved at the children, his smile impossibly wide. "Hey, hey, hey, who's ready for some fun?" Mr. Giggles called, his voice booming with exaggerated cheer. The kids erupted into cheers, gathering around him as he began his routine. Balloon animals, silly jokes, and exaggerated pratfalls that sent the children into fits of laughter. At first, everything went perfectly. Mr. Giggles seemed to know exactly what to do to keep the kids entertained, and even Sarah found herself smiling, relieved that things were going well. The parents chatted among themselves, sipping lemonade, and Sarah allowed herself to relax for the first time in days. But then, Sarah noticed Mr. Giggles pulling out a flask from his jacket, taking a long drink while the kids were distracted by a game. She frowned, her unease growing as his movements became less precise, his jokes slurring slightly. He stumbled as he tried to twist a balloon into shape, and the smile on his painted face began to look more forced, his eyes glazed. Sarah's concern deepened when Mr. Giggles made a joke to one of the parents that had a strange, uncomfortable edge to it. She saw the other mom's face fall, her eyes widening in shock. Sarah's instincts kicked in. She moved closer, trying to keep an eye on Mr. Giggles without alarming the kids. "All right, kiddos, time for the special game. Everyone line up," Mr. Giggles announced, his voice louder now, a frantic edge to it. He swayed slightly, his red nose almost falling off. The children hesitated, sensing something was off. "Mr. Giggles, I think it's time to wrap things up," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. She walked over, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the other parents on her, waiting, uncertain. "Wrap things up? No, no, no! The party's just getting started!" Mr. Giggles snapped, his wide grin faltering, his eyes narrowing at Sarah. He grabbed a prop, a rubber chicken, and threw it on the ground with a force that startled the children. They flinched, their laughter fading into nervous silence. "Come on, kids! We're gonna play, and no one's leaving!" Mr. Giggles barked, his voice suddenly harsh. He lunged towards the kids, trying to pull Emily and her friend forward. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, fear surging through her. "Get away from them!" she yelled, stepping between Mr. Giggles and the children. Her voice shook, but she stood her ground. "It's time for you to leave." The backyard fell silent, the tension thick. The children clung to each other, some beginning to cry. The parents moved closer, their faces pale, unsure of what to do. "You think you can just tell me what to do?" Mr. Giggles's face twisted, the friendly mask slipping away entirely. He took a step towards Sarah, his breath reeking of alcohol. "I'm not finished here." Before things could escalate further, the sound of sirens filled the air, cutting through the tension like a knife. One of the parents must have called the police. Mr. Giggles turned, his eyes widening in panic as two officers approached the backyard, their hands on their belts. "Sir, step away from the lady and the children," one of the officers commanded, his voice firm. Mr. Giggles hesitated, his body tense, before he dropped his shoulders in defeat. The officers moved quickly, grabbing his arms and leading him away as he mumbled incoherently, the once joyful entertainer now just a sad, angry man. The children watched, their eyes wide, as Mr. Giggles was taken away. The neighbors had gathered, drawn by the commotion, their expressions a mix of shock and concern. Sarah knelt down, pulling Emily and her little brother close, her heart aching at the fear in their eyes. "It's okay, it's over now," she whispered, her voice trembling. She kissed the tops of their heads, trying to soothe them, though her own heart was still pounding. She looked up, meeting the eyes of the other parents, and saw her own fear reflected back at her. That night, after everyone had gone home and the yard was quiet once more, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She stared at the glowing reviews she'd seen online for Mr. Giggles, her stomach churning. It was so easy to trust what seemed perfect on the surface, to let her guard down when everything looked right. But today had shown her that appearances could be deceiving, and the safety of her children was too precious to leave to chance. She closed her laptop, her decision made. From now on, she would trust her instincts first, no matter what the reviews said. Story 4. The headlights illuminated a figure standing on the side of the road, a lone hitchhiker wearing a vintage Halloween mask. Mark and Laura exchanged glances, a mix of curiosity and hesitation flickering between them. It was late, the road was dark, and they were on their way to visit the famous haunted house attraction they had heard so much about. Picking up a hitchhiker seemed like something out of a horror movie, but maybe that was what made it thrilling. Mark pulled over, rolling down the window. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of caution. The hitchhiker nodded, his mask hiding any expression. Without a word, he climbed into the back seat, his presence filling the small space with an unspoken tension. As they drove, the hitchhiker remained silent, staring straight ahead. Laura, a horror aficionado, found herself more intrigued than afraid at first. She tried to break the silence. "Where are you headed?" she asked, glancing back. The hitchhiker turned his masked face towards her, but said nothing. Instead, he just stared, the hollow eyes of the mask seeming to pierce right through her. Mark tried to laugh it off, keeping his eyes on the road. "Must be one of those strong, silent types," he said, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The hitchhiker's silence was unnerving, and it wasn't long before Mark started feeling a growing unease. He caught glimpses of the hitchhiker in the rearview mirror, the mask seemingly shifting. One moment it looked blank, the next it appeared to be smiling. The tension in the car thickened as the minutes dragged on. The radio crackled, static breaking the silence before an old, distorted voice came through, repeating words Mark recognized all too well. "The crash. It should have been you." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His heart pounded, memories of the accident that had taken his best friend flooding back. He hadn't told anyone about those thoughts, about the guilt he carried. He glanced at Laura, but she was staring at the hitchhiker, her face pale. "Mark, did you hear that?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. The hitchhiker turned his head slowly towards Mark, as if he knew exactly what the voice meant. Laura's curiosity had turned to fear. She watched as the hitchhiker reached into his coat pocket, her mind racing. She thought about the unresolved tragedy in her own family, about the cousin who had vanished years ago. The hitchhiker seemed to know. He seemed to know everything. She could feel it in the way he stared at her, as if he was peeling away her secrets one by one. The haunted house attraction was just up ahead, the old building looming in the distance, its silhouette dark against the night sky. Mark pulled into the gravel driveway, his breath shallow. He turned to the hitchhiker, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is where we're stopping," he said. "You can get out here." The hitchhiker didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head, the mask shifting again. This time, the mouth seemed to curl into a grin. Mark's stomach twisted. He reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Laura tried her door, but it was stuck too. The hitchhiker slowly raised his hand, pointing towards the haunted house. The radio crackled again, the same voice echoing through the car. "You can't escape! You have to face it!" Panic set in. Mark and Laura struggled with their seatbelts, their breaths coming in short gasps. The hitchhiker just sat there, watching, his presence overpowering. The lights of the haunted house flickered on, illuminating the dark windows, and Mark could see shadows moving inside, figures that shouldn't be there. "Let us out!" Laura screamed, her voice breaking. The hitchhiker turned his head towards her, the mask now showing an expression of pure malice. He reached forward, his gloved hand resting on Mark's shoulder. The touch was cold, sending a shiver down Mark's spine. Suddenly, the car doors flew open, the locks clicking free. Mark and Laura tumbled out, falling onto the gravel, their hearts racing. They scrambled to their feet, running towards the haunted house, the only light in the darkness. When they looked back, the hitchhiker was gone. The car sat empty, the rear door hanging open, the mask lying on the back seat. They didn't stop running until they were inside the haunted house, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. The air inside was thick, the shadows deep, but they felt safer there than they had in the car. Mark looked at Laura, his hands still trembling. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Laura shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but it knew us, Mark. It knew everything." The haunted house was supposed to be just an attraction, a place for scares and laughs. But as they stood there, the silence pressing in, they realized that whatever had followed them wasn't done. The mask lay in the car, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. The shadows seemed to move, and they knew. This was only the beginning of the nightmare. They had picked up something they couldn't shake, something that knew their fears, their secrets. And as the lights flickered, they understood that the haunted house wasn't just a destination, it was a trap, and they were already caught. Story 5. October 31st, 2022. 6 friends, Maya, Tyler, Sophia, Alex, Liam, and Chloe, decided to spend Halloween night at a secluded lake, a place known for its eerie legends. They had heard the story of the ghost bride who supposedly appeared each year searching for lost souls. It was just a rumor, but they thought it would be fun to perform a summoning ritual. None of them took it seriously, not even Maya, the leader of the group. They were there for a good scare, nothing more. They reached the lake just after sunset, the sky a deep shade of purple, the water still and dark. Tyler set up the fire while Liam unpacked the supplies. Maya stood at the edge of the lake, her eyes scanning the water. She didn't believe in ghosts, but there was something about the lake that made her uneasy. She brushed it off, laughing as Tyler made a joke about the ghost bride coming to take them away. They gathered around the fire, the ritual just a game to them. Sophia, the quiet one, lit a candle, her hands trembling slightly. She had always been superstitious, and the thought of actually summoning a spirit made her nervous. But she didn't want to be the one to back out. She looked at Maya, who nodded, her expression confident. "It's just for fun," Maya said. "Nothing's going to happen." They began the ritual, each of them speaking the words they had found online. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and the temperature seemed to drop. Liam, who had always been sensitive to the energy around him, felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at the others, but no one seemed to notice. He closed his eyes, trying to shake off the feeling. Then the lake rippled. The water, which had been calm, began to move, small waves lapping at the shore. Maya laughed, but her voice was strained. "Must be the wind," she said, but her eyes were wide. Tyler, always trying to prove himself, stood up, his arms spread wide. "Come on, ghost bride! Show yourself!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the lake. The water stilled, the wind dying down. For a moment, everything was silent. Then they saw her, a figure in white, standing at the edge of the lake, her veil flowing in the breeze. Sophia gasped, her eyes fixed on the bride. "Is this real?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The ghost bride began to move, her footsteps silent as she walked towards them. Maya felt her heart pound, her childhood fear of water resurfacing. She had nearly drowned once when she was a kid, and the memory came flooding back. She tried to laugh it off, but the bride's eyes locked onto hers, and she felt a wave of terror wash over her. "You can't hide from it," the bride whispered, her voice carrying across the lake. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Tyler, but he was frozen, his face pale. The bride turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You think you're strong?" she said, her voice cold. "But you're just a scared little boy." Tyler's bravado crumbled, his hands shaking as he took a step back. Sophia felt a darkness settle over her, the bride's presence intensifying the thoughts she had tried so hard to push away. She could feel the urge to hurt herself, the whispers in her mind growing louder. She stared at the bride, unable to look away, her fear mixing with a strange sense of fascination. Alex, the jokester of the group, tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. The bride turned to him, her eyes reflecting the image of a car crash. His car, the accident he had caused, the guilt he had buried. He stumbled back, his heart pounding, the vision playing over and over in his mind. Liam, the empath, could feel the bride's anger, her pain. He tried to speak, to reach out to her, but her gaze turned to him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You feel it all, don't you?" she whispered. "You take on their pain, but who takes on yours?" Liam felt a tear slip down his cheek, the weight of her words crushing him. Panic set in. The friends scrambled to their feet, the fire flickering, the air growing colder by the second. Maya grabbed Sophia's hand, pulling her away from the bride. "We have to go," she said, her voice shaking. Tyler and Alex were already running, their fear overtaking them. Liam hesitated, his eyes on the bride, but Maya pulled him away, her grip tight. They ran through the woods, the branches scratching at their skin, the bride's whispers following them. "You can't run from your past," she called, her voice echoing in the darkness. The friends didn't stop until they reached the car, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They piled in, Tyler fumbling with the keys, his hands trembling. The engine roared to life and they sped away, the lake disappearing behind them. No one spoke, the weight of what they had seen hanging over them. Maya looked at her friends, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. She knew they had all seen something that night, something that knew them, something that had drawn strength from their darkest memories. As they drove away, the whispers faded, but the feeling of dread remained. They had come to the lake for a thrill, for a scare, but they had found something far more real. The ghost bride had shown them their fears, their secrets, and they knew she wasn't done. The lake was behind them, but the nightmare was far from over. They had summoned something they couldn't escape, and as the car sped down the dark road, they understood that their pasts were still with them, waiting for the right moment to return.